Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for day number 3 of the 2025 First Stand International Tournament. Again, the first tournament to kick off the big year international-wise in 2025, the big new winter tournament. It's already been a really fun kind of group of games so far up until this point. Both day 1 and day 2 have definitely been full of some surprises. If you want to know my thoughts on those games and those series and those days in general, check out those videos. Linked up in the iCard up there as well is going to be my primer video. It's going to be the playlist for everything we've done on First Stand up until this point, so check that out if you are interested. But today, we're going to be going over day number 3 in particular, and this is really a do-or-die day. Try saying that 5 times fast. A do-or-die day for one team, really, for the top 4, for trying to make sure that you are not the one team eliminated from the group stage. This day is going to determine a lot. We either see an upset or we don't. We also have an interesting matchup to kick off our day as well, so if you're excited, let me know down in the comments section below. Let me know what you thought of these games. Let me know if they went towards your expectations or if maybe you were surprised by the way that things went. Obviously, I'll be going over everything here today, but without further ado, let's get into the content. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in both of the best of 3s here today, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will be looking at the standings at the end of today, and honestly, again, we could be seeing the last of the really intriguing days when it comes to qualifying for the best of 5s. If the expected results go to plan today, then it's gonna be determined who is that one team at the bottom of the standings. But of course, nothing is set in stone. You still gotta play the game. So I'm excited to go over it, but we'll get to that series a bit later. The first series that we're gonna cover today is a battle between the 2 undefeated teams left at this tournament, the 2 teams that are 1-0 heading into day number 3 here. It's a matchup between the CTBC Flying Oysters of the LCP and Hanwha Life Esports of the LCK. Again, these are the 2 undefeated teams, and I think very much coming from different expectations. CFO was expected to be the weakest team at this tournament, and yet they pulled off the pretty convincing upset yesterday against Corp. There is a real possibility that this could be like the 3rd best team at this tournament if everything were to click for them. There isn't a huge difference in ability between them, Corp, Team Liquid, and so if they're just adapting to the meta better, if their 6th man in the top lane ends up really helping them in Fearless in a tournament like this, perhaps that could just be a big advantage for them. However, this is really going to be their first big test of the tournament. The win over Corp was obviously fantastic, but HLE is a completely different beast on the other side of this matchup. This is the best team at this tournament, the big favorite to end up taking it home, and quite frankly, they're gigantic favorites in this series. Really, all you're looking for CFO is for them to be able to hang, for them to be able to make it closer, to make the games fun. If they can do that, you're going to feel pretty okay about that, because HLE is just kind of better than everybody else right now. They certainly are more consistent. We've seen the LCK dominate internationally for quite a few years. It really seems like they've gotten their mojo back. It feels like they've become 1A again, not even like a 1 shared with anybody else. Like, they are the #1 region in the world again. The LPL is close, but not quite there at the current moment, and HLE is really kind of pushing that forward. So CFO definitely have their work cut out for them. I think obviously the most important player that you can look at here is going to be Doggo. We've talked so much about how Viper has been kind of inconsistent for HLE over the course of this year, especially domestically. Obviously, we haven't seen any bad games from him at this tournament so far, but Doggo is the kind of player that can win 2v2 even against some of the better bot lanes. He was excellent against Corp, and he's been awesome domestically. These 2 have faced off against each other multiple times. They were in the LPL together for a good portion of time, and so they're familiar with each other's games. They're not going to be like surprised or shocked by any of the comfort picks that may be brought out. They know how each other play from a laning perspective, and that could actually be in Doggo's favor because he does understand Viper and maybe understands a way to be able to kind of lane against him in a more sustainable way. That's obviously the matchup that I'm looking at, but Junjia going into Peanut here. Obviously, this is important for both of these teams. Junjia is very integral as a facilitator, but Peanut's early games have gotten so much better over the course of this year. He's gotten to the point now where I can't even remember the last time he didn't have a gold lead going into the mid game. You know, I got some comments on yesterday's video when I was talking about how Kanavi really underperformed against HLE, being like, you're overrating how bad Kanavi was. He was the only one even attempting to try, especially in game number 1. To me, that is KDA scouting. Like, I hate to just call out a comment, but like that's KDA scouting as much as it can be. The 5-4-1 game from Kanavi was awful. Like, he completely inted that game away, and a lot of that was Peanut just being able to out pressure him. When you actually go back and look at the tape, he did not play well at all in that game, and most of that can be attributed to the fact that Peanut has really been that good in the early game recently. And if that's going to be able to maintain, Junji is already not a particularly great early game jungler. He's much more of a team fighter, definitely somebody who wants to facilitate more in the 5v5, like that's going to be a problem for CFO. Top lane's going to be interesting. Can either of their top laners go up against Zeus? Obviously, Hongq going to his first international tournament, having to take on Zeka, who's maybe the most clutch player in the world. Like, there's a lot going on here that CFO aren't going to necessarily be favored in, but at the end of the day, they're going to have a chance to prove people wrong. They've already done that once by beating Corp, not just like in a series, but beating them both games, not dropping a single game to them. If they can even pick up one against HLE, or hell, if they can even make any of these games close, that's already going to be considered a massive win for them. HLE have to win this, and they have to win it in dominant fashion. This is one of the games that you can't really afford to kind of look bad in. I think of all of the regions, you probably need to be beating up on the LCP most of all. Even NA and EU probably should be, taking more off of HLE than a team like CFO. And so this is one of those pride games where you're not necessarily playing for your chance to be able to get out of this group. You're probably going to be able to get out of the group stage and be fine in the bracket stage, but you don't really want to go down and make this look more interesting than it needs to be. You should look like the best team at the tournament here. So that's really the narrative that we're going to be following. Can CFO pull off a miracle, or HLE going to get the job done in emphatic and expected fashion? The only way to know, of course, is to go game by game. So let's get into it. Let's get into game number one. The winner of game number one was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to pick up the win here in game number one. They're going to go 1-0 at the start of this series. Everybody knows that game one is probably the most important game in a best of three. It really opens up your options for not only game two, but for game three, if you do end up getting into that, because it gives you side selection basically for that game three if it were to come to that. But I don't know if it's going to come to that in this series. I'm just going to say that right now. Obviously, HLE were already mega favorites, and they decimated CFO in game number one. When we wanted to talk about them, coming out and proving expectations correct, like living up to the hype, this is exactly how you come out and live up to the hype, is you absolutely obliterate a team like CFO, which they did here. You can basically look at anybody on the side of HLE and give them a lot of credit for how they ended up playing, and you can basically look at anybody on the side of CFO and kind of criticize how they ended up playing in this one. But let's go ahead and talk about draft first and foremost, as we always do. I think these drafts are fine from both sides. Honestly, I don't hate the draft from CFO. I think you're hoping and praying, kind of banking on the fact that Ezreal's going to be in a good spot. You do need Doggo to win, as we talked about in the 2v2. It's been so integral to how their early games go anyways, because Junji and Hongq aren't exactly early game players. That being said, like, Doggo doesn't have to do everything this game. I think flexing the Karma up top is an interesting decision. Not one that I'm a huge fan of, but, certainly something that they decided to do, and Rest wasn't in a horrible spot. I think Azir into Yone should be Azir favored in terms of how that matchup goes early, if only because I just don't know if the Yone is going to be able to actually do anything against Azir. He should do a really good job of being able to stall this game out. The issue CFO ends up having, at least in my opinion, is that I do believe that they have a harder fight to execute in the late game, if only based off the fact that I think Yone plus Rumble is very, very hard to deal with in 5v5s right now. You have so much setup on the side of HLE, not only the Vi and the Rakan, obviously for hard forms of engage, but Yone can engage with ultimate. You have Ashe Arrow that could potentially be a go button or just kind of a follow-up tool. Like, there is so much going on for HLE that I do think their comp is going to get better as the game goes along. Not only that, but I do trust them more in the 5v5s, which makes CFO's draft a little bit more up in the air, because you're kind of playing around Wukong Azir, which you would think wants to play for the late game, but drafting things like Karma and drafting like an Ezreal in the bot lane to go into Yone, like, you're playing safe in the early game. You don't necessarily have that same kind of late game dominant pressure that you can match with like a Rumble on the other side. And so I do think there's a bit of a timer on here, and I think anytime you have the better team scale better, it's a bit of a problem for the team that is worse, that you kind of want an out. Typically speaking, if you're a bad team, you want to be able to hang into the game by any means necessary, and I'm just not sure CFO ended up having it with this draft. That's my personal opinion. Obviously, I'm sure there are going to be people that disagree, because Wukong Azir should be good in the later half of the game, but I do think CFO needed a gold lead in order to make this draft as effective as they probably wanted it to be. Player of the game for me, though, in game one is going to go to Peanut in the jungle on this Vi. I think that there were multiple options here. I think Zeka looked awesome on the Yone. I think Zeus looked great on the Rumble. I think Delight looked awesome on the Rakan. Basically, everybody on HLE ended up really proving their worth in this one, but to me, Peanut was the most active and the most important member of this team, and he really is having a phenomenal tournament. He's just taking over games so consistently at the moment. He's gotten better and better as games have gone along throughout the year. We talked about some inconsistencies that he might have been having at the start of 2025. Those are long behind him at this point. Even when you talk about like the finals domestically, like he was already already, you know, starting to play really consistent in that series. Things have really clicked for him here, and he is looking like definitively the best jungler at this tournament, and I don't even think it's really all that up for debate. You don't need to convince me that Peanut's very good. I've been on the Peanut hype train for almost a decade at this point, so I feel pretty good about watching him continue to dominate in the way that he does. Vi is a pick that we've seen kind of run it down the past couple of days, specifically with Yike piloting it, so it's nice to see an actually effective Vi game here at this tournament. Zeus, Zeka were also great. The solo laners did everything they were supposed to do. The Karma was interesting on the other side. Again, I'm really not a fan of Karma. I just don't think she does nearly enough in the back half of the game to justify her pick right now. I know that there are some positives generally to like shutting down some laning phases, and I'm sure that Rest or CFO in general are looking at this as like a counter matchup to Rumble. I just don't necessarily see that. Rumble is always going to be more useful than Karma the later this game ends up going. Like, there's no way she's ever going to be able to match his pressure in team fights, and you're kind of relying on Rest to be able to outlane Zeus, and I think that's just a really big ask, and Zeus took advantage of that. Another really good Rumble game. This champion is super overtuned. Like, Kalista is rightfully getting first banned in a lot of instances. I think Rumble is very clearly the second strongest champion in the meta right now behind Kalista, and he's still getting a lot of play throughout these games. Zeka's really good on Yone. Like, what do you want me to say about that? You know what I mean? Hankyu's in an okay matchup on a champion that fits his playstyle that he is good at, and Zeka just completely obliterated him on the Yone. It wasn't even remotely close. We'll get into that later. Delight continues to play like the best support in the world. Viper was kind of that secondary carry, you know, background character on the Ashe. That's all he really needed to be. He needed to not lose to the Ezreal, and he did exactly that. So basically everybody on HLE kind of doing their job and accomplishing what needs to be accomplished. And for CFO, it is a bit of a disaster. What we are seeing as a consistent trend throughout First Stand is that the middle of the map that ends up disappointing and losing and not doing particularly well, that's the team that ends up like just losing the game. Like, there's basically no way to win if the middle of your map is going to get demolished. And quite frankly, CFO's middle of the map got demolished. I mean, you want to give dud of the game to Junjie or Hongkyu, it's really up to you. I'm giving it to Hongkyu because, again, I think the Azir is actually in an okay spot in this game when it comes to like the draft and the comps around him. I think Azir could potentially have a CS lead here in a neutral matchup so long as you're able to hang in lane with Zeka, but he got obliterated. Like, it wasn't even remotely close. Zeka was 800 billion times better than him in this game number one. It felt like they weren't even on the same quadrant, and for Hongkyu to have that happen in a good matchup on a champion he's comfortable with his like go-to playstyle, it is like a disaster for Hongkyu, especially because you are one dit. And again, I want to criticize the Yone here. There's so many things in the meta that like really punish Azir. Something like Talia was up, something like Ari was up for this team to pair with the Vi. They chose to go with the Yone because Zeka's really good at champions like that, and he still demolished the lane, even though it's not quite as good of a matchup as those other champions are into Azir. It's just brutal for Hongkyu. Really not a good look for him. Junjie got completely out jungled. This is more the Junjie we've seen at international tournaments recently. I'm not criticizing him for losing to Peanut. I don't think anybody expected him to be able to go toe-to-toe with Peanut, but you know, the Wukong did not work. He didn't get to the late game teamfight facilitative type of role that he wanted to get to here. Doggo and Kaiwing couldn't really do anything. Doggo had a pretty weak game here, all things considered. He did try to force the issue a little bit later on, but he needed to be able to win in the 2v2, and he didn't. Rest was okay on the top side, but again, I think the Karma is just a bit of a waste of a champion in a draft where you are not the better team. I think it ended up kind of really coming back to bite them. So overall, just not really a great game one from CFO, and I'm really not expecting them to turn it around here in game number two. Maybe they surprise me. You never really know what ends up happening, but the only way to know is to check out game two. Is HLE going to be able to close this out in an expected dominant 2-0 sweep, or is CFO going to shock the world and be able to come back from what was a decimation to tie the series up at 1 apiece? Well, the winner of game number two was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number two. They're going to take this series 2-0, and yeah, we all kind of saw this coming. Nobody is surprised, but you know what? This was a fun game if I've ever seen one. Absolutely ridiculous what this draft is for HLE. Vladimir top, Nidalee with no setup in the jungle, and yes, you are seeing that right. Zed mid, R5 Zeka Zed in the mid lane for HLE. It's the first Korean Zed in half a decade, and he still won on it. It's absolutely ridiculous just how much better HLE was in this series. They clearly were not even taking it all that seriously. They were treating game number two as a fun game, and they still won it in sub 30 minutes. It's actually absurd how good this team is, how talented this team is. Mechanics are unreal, and we'll talk about that as we go further along. I think there is something to play for with this draft. I always talk about that here. There is always something to play for in every draft, basically, that you're going to see at a pro level, and that's still the case here for HLE. even if the actual win condition of this is much harder than it would be for a regular draft. But for CFO, like, I get the idea of trying to counter a lot of the things that were coming in. You see the Vladimir on R4, and you assume that's probably going to Zeus on the top side. You see things like Nidalee, and you see, like, Viper playing Misfortune. You're like, oh, they're setting up for an early game dominant thing. Let's go ahead and play around Corki. Let's play around Kindred. We have this double marksman for later in the game. We have the Gragas early on to disrupt the Misfortune ultimate. Like, we have options here. We have things that we can play around. We scale really well. We have really good siege if we do end up getting on towers. Like, Corki's going to be able to push forever. Talia's going to be able to push forever. It should be totally fine for us going into HLE. And then you see that R5 Zed, and you're like, oh, wait, every single person on our team dies to Zed, and it's a really big problem. And you know what? It wasn't as much of a problem as maybe you would have expected, but it still was a bit of an issue. So let's talk about the drafts. Again, I think these are two very distinct win conditions. HLE has to win early. Honestly, they do kind of have three winning lanes. Vladimir beats Gragas, as far as I'm aware. Zed definitely beats Talia. Like, Talia cannot handle the combat power of Zed. He can roam just as effortlessly as she can, especially when she doesn't have ultimate, and he's gonna do a lot more in those fights than she is, at a much easier pace than she is. Nidalee definitely controls the early game. You have Misfortune going into Corki. Like, you're looking at all of these lanes and seeing winning lanes for HLE. There is zero scaling on this team, like, actually negative scaling. Like, I guess Vladimir theoretically could win a team fight for you in the late game, but if Vladimir is like your number one option, if you're hoping a team fight is like Zed can assassinate someone on a backline, and then Vlad plus Misfortune ultimate is like your primary source of consistent damage in a team fight, like, that's a disaster. There is no way this team is ever going to be able to win if you don't dominate early. HLE obviously knew they were going to dominate early, and that's exactly what they did, but it certainly did require a bit of laning prowess for CFO. Like, I get it. Again, double marksman. Talia's a pick I really like. Gragas interrupts the Misfortune ultimate. I can see the vision here, trying to play around sieging a bunch of towers and just, like, hoping and praying that you get your jungle ADC super fed in this game. The problem is it just doesn't ever end up happening. You're not going to be able to get to the stage of the game where you're going to be able to poke out a lot of these fights and control, like, objective areas first. You're never going to be able to get an objective in the mid game playing Kindred Corki into Zed, Nidalee, Misfortune. Like, how are you ever supposed to contest anything in the mid game in this? It's a disaster for CFO in that regard, and they got really punished there, but we'll talk about that more when we get to them. Player of the game is obviously Zeus here for game number 2. Like, I didn't have to think about this at all. This Vladimir actually went absolutely insane. I know, obviously, this is a good matchup for Vlad on the top side into the Gragas, and we'll talk about Driver, who did not look good at all here today. He didn't even look all that particularly good on the Scion into K-Corp. He definitely looks like the weaker top laner at this tournament, which is the exact opposite read I had of those two going into the tournament, but Zeus obliterated him. It wasn't even remotely close. The Vladimir looked exceptionally good. You gotta give credit to Zeka here on the Zed as well. That pick really did end up turning out to be a bit of a problem for CFO because everybody dies to a Zed combo on the other side of this matchup. But player of the series to me is going to go to Peanut in the jungle after that fantastic game 1 on the Vi, and then a really good game number 2 here on the Nidalee as well. I didn't really have to think about this too much. I felt pretty good about Peanut. It could go to Zeus. I think that that's pretty reasonable as well. One of those two should be player of the series. I'm giving it to Peanut just because I think the consistency with which he had jungle pressure throughout this series was actually absurd, and I was really impressed with what we ended up seeing from him. But Zeus, like I said, also completely popped off. Playing Nidalee into Kindred can sometimes be a bit of a scary proposition, if only because you do just get outscaled pretty infinitely. Like, it's very difficult to be as relevant as Kindred if things don't go your way in the early game, but Peanut has basically been unstoppable on Nidalee throughout 2025, and that carried over here. Viper and Delight were the better bot lane here, even if Doggo finally had a good game where he stepped up. It's just not even close. Like, HLE is not close in skill level to CFO. They trolled this draft. This was like a legit for fun draft in their case, and they still ended up walking out of here with a victory. So credit to them, I guess. You know, they definitely made a statement here, but for CFO on the other side, yikes. You know, you expected this team to get trounced, but maybe not by Vladimir Zed. Like, that maybe wasn't the idea here at this tournament. You know, there are a lot of things you could criticize. Driver is absolutely done of the game. Like, this is one of the worst Gragas games I've ever seen. It truly was absolutely nothing coming in from him, but I can't even really blame him. Again, the Vladimir matchup's not really all that ideal for Gragas. You early slam this in the top lane because you want to try and disrupt the bullet time in the back half of the game coming in from Viper, but getting counterpicked in that way just completely destroys your laning phase, and you're never going to have any stats throughout this game. He was involved in 1 of their 11 kills throughout this, which is a nightmare. Hong Q looked completely outclassed by Zeka throughout the entirety majority of this series. Hanwha was already a player that I was concerned about his laning coming into this tournament. He's a good team fighter, not a great laner. I think that was really expedited here by HLE. You know, Kaiwing was fine. I think Junjia definitely got out jungled in the early game, tried to do his best, got facilitated as the Kindred, but was definitely not able to take over here. Doggo was probably the best player in this game on the Corki, but only so much you can do on that champion when the rest of your team is getting obliterated and you have no way to skirmish over objectives. You know, that's the problem with Corki. It's the reason we've kind of seen him fall out of the meta, is he just doesn't have a very good or very active mid game. So overall, that's it for CFO, right? Like, they're 1-1. You kind of expected this. They're 2-2 in terms of game score, still in an okay spot. You know, depending on what happens later today, they could still be a team that's already qualified for the best of 5 stage, but nothing is set in stone just yet. There's still a lot to play for, and obviously that next series is going to show us a lot, but at least for HLE, they're definitely in the clear at this point. They look like the best team in the world. Then moving on to our second series of the day, and this is really the one that's going to determine a lot. We kind of knew what was going to happen in the first series. There was no major upset, but we'll have to see if that can carry over into the second series. It's the representative from the LEC in K-Corp taking on the representative from the LPL in top Esports. The reason this series is so important is K-Corp is sitting at 0-2, and they've already lost to probably the 2 weakest teams that they're going to face at this tournament in Team Liquid and the CTBC Flying Oysters. They've gone 0-2 against those two teams, well, 1-2 against Team Liquid, 0-2 against CFO, and if they don't pick up a win against either Top Esports or HLE, there is no universe where they can make it out. Even if they pick up a win against either Top Esports or HLE, they're probably going to have to pick up a win against both, or at the very least, they're going to have to do it more dominantly than the other teams that end up beating each other, because they're going to lose the head-to-head against both Team Liquid and CFO, who are likely going to be the teams they're competing against to get out of this group stage. And so it's kind of do or die for K-Corp. If they don't win this series, especially if they don't win it 2-0, you're probably not looking at a team that's going to be able to survive and probably will be getting last here, and they are the underdogs going into this series. Top Esports are definitely favorites. Not only were they big favorites coming into the tournament, but they easily dispatched of Team Liquid yesterday, who was the team that beat K-Corp on day number 1. The expectation is for this series to not be particularly close. Now, obviously, K-Corp should be a better team than a team like CFO, who ended up getting destroyed by HLE, and Top Esports should be a worse team than HLE. They got beaten by them on day number 1, and so theoretically, you should be having a closer series, a more interesting conversation surrounding this. They were number 2 and number 3 in my power rankings going into this tournament, respectively, but like in terms of how things have gone, it's just hard not to see Top Esports as such a gigantic favorites. When you look down at like the matchup chart here for these two teams, like it's really hard to see an avenue where K-Corp can come out on top. Kana has been by far the player that has performed the best for them at this tournament so far, and 369 has kind of just been better than Kana over the course of this year, and if anything, if nothing else, like 369 is a really good weak side player that can really, you know, just play tanks and kind of neutralize the enemy top laner and allow the rest of his team to be able to win. Obviously, the middle of the map has been a nightmare for K-Corp. It's been the worst part of this entire tournament. Yike has been the worst player at this tournament. The jungler for K-Corp, Vladi, has probably been second on that list. The mid laner for K-Corp, they've been unplayable through the first 2 days, like actually have been getting destroyed every single time this team takes the Rift, and they're going up against Kanavi and Cream. I don't really feel great about that matchup. Kalist and Targamas have been fine, but Jackie Love and Crisp are definitely the better bot lane between these two. Like, it just doesn't look good when you go down the matchup chart. You, first of all, need the middle of the map to survive. It's not just about winning. Like, whether they win or not, like, that's cool and all, they have to survive. They can't lose by the same amount that they lost to Junjia and Hanwha, and they can't lose by the same amount they lost to and APA. Like, it's unacceptable for them to play the way that they have so far, and if they don't play closer to what they were domestically, the series is over before it starts. Like, if you get anything close to what they've been through the first 2 days, it's not playable for K-Corp. But if you do get that, then you probably need either Kalist or Kana to step up and be a primary carry option, because I'm just not sure Yike or Vladi are going to be able to do that in this series. Targamas is going to have to be able to take advantage of Crisp, and that's not something that I'm necessarily expecting. So much would have to go right for K-Corp in order to compete in this series, and Top Esports, really a lot would have to go wrong for them in order for them to be exploitable in the same kind of way they need to be in this series. It technically is possible, but I'm certainly not expecting it, especially after what we've seen so far, with K-Corp having so much less time to scrim and practice and get used to the Korean environment than everybody else, because the regular season ended up, ending very late. Like, it's just not a tournament that I think favors K-Corp. So we'll go ahead and obviously see what ends up happening, but, it's do or die. Like, they have to win now, and game number 1 is the most important game in the series. They have to pick this up. So are they going to be able to? Well, the winner of game number 1 was K-Corp, they are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up 1-0 in this series. And we talked about it being do or die. We talked about them needing to be able to pick up this win. Well, here you go. They picked up the win. They dominated this game number 1. They looked incredibly good. They were the better team by far. And honestly, they did it by kind of exploiting a pretty common draft process that a lot of teams have on blue side. Kalista's been pick or ban for a lot of teams throughout this tournament, basically every team throughout this tournament. And K-Corp said, well, they have blue side. What if we just leave it up, let them pick it, and then we just pick Ashe, and we pick Skarner, and we pick a bunch of these champions that do a really good job of making Kalista have to be a lot safer down in the bot lane, and you know what? That's exactly what happened. Top Esports end up getting Kalista on B1. You know, K-Corp immediately draft the Ashe as the counter pick. They play it with something like Karma that can really pressure out the laning phase. Like, it really makes sure that Renata doesn't have full lane prio and control over this. It really neutralizes the 2v2 dominance of Kalista Renata, because they can't really play all that easily into Ashe and Karma. It's a pretty winning lane for K-Corp, and then you just have a bunch of, like, facilitators elsewhere. Skarner and Taliyah are great setup. Kana's been dominant at this tournament. Put him on something that can do a lot of damage like the Jace. I really like this draft for K-Corp from an idea perspective. That doesn't mean I hate the draft for Top Esports. They still get what a lot of people consider to be the strongest bot lane in the game right now in Kalista and Renata, and I think when you're looking at the solo lanes, both solo laners are in a pretty decent position to be fine in this game. The R5 Taliyah opens up things for mid-game skirmishes and does give them the opportunity to play that kind of style, but Aurora's really good. Like, Aurora's a good champion, and Cream's really good at this champ, and obviously she should be able to have prio here. And Bessa can just neutralize a lot of the Jace pressure early on in this game, and so I don't necessarily think top lane is like a runaway in favor of K-Corp or anything like that. The Viego should be able to outscale and deal more damage in the late game. Like, there are definitely opportunities and options here for Top Esports to be able to win this. They just didn't. Like, I think both of these teams kind of fall off in the late game. Whoever ends up winning these skirmishes is probably just going to win the game, and that's what happened for K-Corp. They were just more clinical and better in a lot of these mid-game skirmishes, and that's what got them ahead. You have a couple of players that were really active on the map, and I want to point them out, but basically everybody on K-Corp played well. This was a team gap. I'm not going to try and say that one lane or two lanes ended up being way farther ahead than everybody else. This really was everybody winning on the side of K-Corp and really just outplaying their opponents, which is a huge thing to see from them, but let's go ahead and talk about it. Targamas is going to get my player of the game on the Karma. Big day for Karma players. It gets played in both series. This time, though, in the role that I think it's a little bit better in a situation that I think is really good for the Karma, because again, it kind of neutralizes a lot of what Kalista Renata want to do alongside the Ashe, and Targamas, man, was he everywhere trying to make plays. He played this super aggro. This is much closer to what we saw from Targamas in the best of 3 stage in the domestic playoffs, when he was really dominating a lot of those series to lead into K-Corp's big playoff run at the end. Like, this is what we wanted to see from Targa, when he's able to control the map, when he has a lot of prio and pressure, and, you know, his team can actively back him up on a lot of these plays. He is super greedy with the things that he looks for, and it really does help out his team in that way when playing from ahead. But it wasn't just him. Vladi was awesome this game on the Taliyah. We needed to see Vladi and Yike show up. Again, this middle of the map, those two in particular, have been absolutely horrific over the course of this tournament, and they were really good here in game number 1. Yike was awesome on the Skarner everywhere he needed to be. Vladi was everywhere on the Taliyah. Like, it was just a mid-game masterclass from these two, and again, this is so much closer to what we saw domestically from Yike and Vladi rather than anything we've seen from them at this tournament so far. That's, you know, a very positive factor. Kana was awesome, led the team in kills on the Jace. He has been easily the best K-Corp player at this entire tournament. Maybe it's because he's used to playing in Korea and the rest of the team obviously didn't have as much time to get ready, but whatever it is, like, Kana's been really good, and the rest of the team is just kind of catching up to his individual performances. Kaliste was really good on the Ashe. We talked about how good that pick was in general for their comp. Like, everything just ended up going in favor of K-Corp. It was a perfect storm here in game number 1, and now you're only 1 game away from taking this series and making this tournament a lot more interesting moving forward. But for Top Esports, this is a really bad game number 1 loss. Not only did you lose to K-Corp, a team that had been kind of embarrassed at this tournament so far, but you lost in kind of embarrassing fashion, with a lot of your players just not playing well. Cream, Jackie Love had awful games here. Your carry duo of mid and AD carry cannot perform like this at a top level and expect to win. Like, it's ridiculous. And obviously Top Esports as a team, as an organization, has a reputation of not performing internationally. It's crazy because it's not like one group of players. There have been multiple players across multiple different iterations of this team, and yet somehow, some way, they do always underperform in these big international moments. But Once again, it's players that you wouldn't expect. Cream just getting absolutely beaten up by Vladi, who's been awful throughout this tournament. Jackie Love being one of the players to really let this team down, getting exploited by picking the consensus, like, strongest champion in the game, like, early on in the draft is ridiculous. Like, it's insane. One caveat that I do want to give Top Esports that I've been talking about for K-Corp as a caveat, so I think it's fair to give it to Top Esports as well. Like, K-Corp, or the LEC and the LPL ended about the same time. Both of these teams got to Korea around the same time. I haven't mentioned it as much for Top Esports because they already, like they're closer to Korea. Like, they don't have to go as far. They're accustomed to the time zone. Like, they don't have to completely change their entire schedule in order to, you know, get used to playing in Korea. Obviously, the LEC teams have a lot more to adjust to in that front, but it's not like Top Esports isn't also immediately coming off of, like, a playoff run where they had to go from back to front. They weren't the number one seed. They had to go from lower bracket all the way to winning the LPL. They didn't get any rest time either, and so, you know, that could be affecting them in that way, but I don't know what else to say. It just was a really bad game number one. Cream is dead of the game on the Aurora. I didn't have to think about this at all. He was awful, like, truly miserable on the Aurora. Jackie Love is getting taken advantage of. Again, the Ashe Karma is so smart from K-Corp in order to punish the Kalista on the other side. Ashe already is very difficult for Kalista to play into, but to neutralize the Renata as well with the Karma pick I thought was great, and Jackie Love really was exploited in that front. 369 was kind of useless on the top side, especially in comparison to Kana, who was just a better player in this game. Crisp was fine. I think Kanabi overall was fine. This was not a horrible game from him, but Yike was definitely more active on the map on the Skarner. Now, part of that is just like a bunch of losing lanes for a Viego, which is not ideal, but it's not a good look for Top Esports, and you know what? If they don't win Game 2, if they lose this series 0-2, things become even more interesting, because instead of K-Corp being at the bottom of the standings, you know who's in 5th place? Top Esports, which would be kind of a disaster, obviously, for them. Now, I'm not expecting them to land in that spot full time, but, like, it's not a good look for Top Esports to drop a series 0-2 to a team that has not been able to pick up a win against anybody else at this tournament so far. This is still a must-win game for K-Corp. Picking up a 2-0 here in terms of their win-loss record actually does potentially salvage their ability to stay in this tournament. It's still not like a guaranteed case or anything. They still would be favorites to be the first team eliminated because of tiebreakers, but it's certainly possible that they could keep themselves alive with a 2-0, so this would be a gigantic win for them. Can they get it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was K-Corp. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to take this series 2-0, and somehow, some way, they're going to walk out of this series not only by winning it, because that already looked like it was going to be, like, not possible for them going into a series like this, but they walk out not dropping a single game. They dominate both of these games, both sub-35, very clean wins, not really a lot of things to worry about. They give up 5 kills in this game across the entirety of the game. It's, like, truly an exceptional performance from K-Corp, regardless of what they looked like at the beginning of this tournament. If K-Corp, you know, played this series is their first series in this tournament without ever looking bad, I would have been like, holy crap, I didn't know they had this in them, let alone after coming out and looking so bad on the first 2 days. But for Top Esports, like, this is a disaster. Again, not only because, like, a pride thing, like, you are the LPL, you should not be getting crushed by any of the regions that are not the LCK. That is just a fact. Not only because this organization and team have historically underperformed internationally and have really gained the reputation of being, you know, big-time chokers at these international tournaments, but because now you're sitting in 5th place. We're going to talk about that as we go further along, but this team is currently the team on the outside looking in. After their first 3 series, they're 1-2. They lost the head-to-head against K-Corp. Like, if worst-case scenario happens and they lose to CFO, obviously that's not expected to happen, but if it does, they're the first team out of this tournament, and that is the worst possible thing that could have ever happened to the LPL. It's probably not going to happen. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but the fact that it's even in discussion is absurd. So let's go ahead and get into this game number 2 and kind of talk about where these drafts ended up going. I mean, the draft for Top Esports is pretty clear. Like, you can see what it's trying to do. They drafted freaking Karthus Corki as their mid-jungle duo. They want to play late game. Like, they have no priority at all. Like, there's literally none on this team. There is no semblance of priority. There is no way to contest team fights. Your jungler can't fight until 20 minutes into the game. Your mid laner doesn't have any sort of prio at all, especially going into a Yone. Like, there's just no way for you to be able to play out the mid game here. You scale very well. Like, if you do get to the front-to-back team fight section, Varus is going to be a bit of a problem. You have a ton of setup with Gnar and Rel, and then Karthus and Corki can obviously be primary damage dealers in that stage of the game, but how the hell are you ever supposed to get there? How are you picking this comp in 2025 in a meta on a map where there are 4 billion objectives, where it's been proven over and over again that whoever ends up winning a lot of these skirmishes, a lot of these 4v4s in the mid game, ends up winning the game. Whoever ends up winning all of those fights ends up winning the game. How do you look at that and go, yeah, Karthus Corki, that's the middle of our map? I just can't reasonably and feasibly believe that a human being drafted this, especially not Home, who's a really good coach. It just feels absurd that this is the direction that they went in. This is not a draft that I could ever sign off on in this meta. You only draft this if you are the worst team. Like, I'm serious. Like, the only way that you can ever get away with this is if you don't think you can win early no matter what. Like, if you don't think there's any way you could ever skirmish with pressure, at least give yourself some sort of out. Like, this is the kind of draft I would have expected CFO to draft against HLE, because it's like, we're probably never going to be able to contest them early. We might as well have a late game out. But like, top esports? Like, what are we doing? This is absurd in my eyes. And K-Corp has such an LEC draft, and it's I mean that positively, like in a good way, where you Ivern Ezreal, right? Like Yone mid for basically no reason early on in the draft. The R5 Aatrox I think really works here. Like, there are just a lot of things that I think point in favor of K-Corp. I'm not the biggest fan of like R1 Yone in the same way that I'm not the biggest fan of like R1 Azir. I actually would be counterpicking mid a lot more than a lot of other pro teams are doing right now, because I do think there are a lot of very strong mid lane matchups. But alongside Ivern, who's just going to have permanent priority in this game, because reminder, Top Esports drafted Karthus on B3, and then Ezreal, who's like the best champion to play into Varus on this patch. I think Ezreal's in a really good spot. You know, he's very consistent. He basically does all the things that Varus wants to do at the times that Varus wants to do it. He doesn't have the CC or the lockdown or like the ability to set up his own plays in that kind of way, but super safe, not really punishable, and is arguably better in a lot of these mid-game team fights. Like, that's a perfect draft pick. Leon is perfect for Targamas to be able to take advantage of Crisp, who's going to be moving around the map. You know, he's going to have to do a lot of the heavy lifting with Karthus and Corki in the middle. So yeah, have something like Leona that can get a lot of picks in that front. It's just really good process from K-Corp, and it's great execution. Yike is going to get not only player of the game, but player of the series here. I think that's 5 of the first 6 series here in First Stand, having a jungler get player of the series. Obviously, I'm not doing that on purpose. I just think jungle has been the most important role towards which teams end up winning at this tournament, and Yike was awesome in this series, was really good on the Skarner in game number 1, and Ivern is like an LEC staple. I think of Razork when I think of this pick, at least in terms of like modern junglers, but like Yike has been really good on it too. Basically, every LEC jungler has had to prioritize Ivern because of the way things have gone domestically, and Yike is still really good on this champ. The champ can still do a ton as a facilitator, kind of what Karma was, what Targamas was on the Karma in game number 1. Very similar role here for Ivern, and it was just as effective in game number 2. Kaliste was excellent on the Ezreal. This is the other champion that I think was really important towards this comp's success. If Ezreal gets super fed, that makes this game a lot easier, and again, it helps win a lot of these skirmishes in the mid game. Targamas did a great job of taking advantage of Crisp, like I said. Vladi was good on the Yone. He had his best series of the tournament by far. Kana was still really good on the Aatrox. He didn't have to be main character in this one like he did in the first 2 days. It's just a lot of good stuff for K-Corp. The win is obviously the thing that matters, but the way that they won is so encouraging, and it's so them, like it is their style, and it does show that they can use that style to win on the international stage, that there's really nothing other to feel right now other than like positivity around K-Corp. And then for Top Esports, like, oh my god, like, I'm not saying this is worst case scenario because you've already picked up a win over Team Liquid. If you lost to both TL and K-Corp, obviously that is worst case scenario, but picking up the win over Team Liquid still puts you in a decent spot so long as you can beat CFO. If you can't, obviously that's, you deserve to be out. Like, if you lose to K-Corp and CFO, you deserve to be out of the tournament, but they looked awful today. Like, no excuses. They were just worse than K-Corp. And obviously their draft is a part of that. Kanavi and Cream deserve a lot of blame for taking these two champions in the circumstances and situations that they took them in. But everybody else on the team also played bad. Crisp is going to get dud of the game here for game number 2. Look at the responsibility that the Rel has in game number 2. I know people are going to get really mad at Crisp, and rightfully so. He did run it down and get caught out multiple times in this game. He had a Crisp-esque performance, but like, who else is going to be making plays at any point in the mid game here? It's literally Crisp or bust. Like, he has to step up. He has to look for everything, or else this team just loses, because Karthus can't do it, Corki can't do it, Nar's going to be preoccupied on the top side. It literally is only Rel in this comp that can do anything in terms of trying to gain priority in the mid game, and so Crisp ended up getting caught out a lot there. Jackie Love was awful. Honestly, just got outplayed in this series. This is one of the worst series I've seen Jackie Love play in quite a while. Like, it kind of harkens back to the HLE series, but there were some series in the regular season against Anyone's Legend that also were a bit concerning. 3 369 was the worst of these two top laners, like, for sure. Like, obviously, Kanavi and Cream deserve, like, I guess, negativity surrounding their draft picks here with the Karthus and Corki, but they still played bad. Like, it's not like the gameplay was significantly better. It just was a bad series for Top Esports. Everything that could have went wrong. They played bad. They got out-executed. They got out-drafted, and now they're in a pretty bad spot. Again, I'm not expecting this team to drop out in the group stage. I still think they'll beat CFO. I still think they will be making their way at 2-2 into the bracket stage, but this team has issues, and they certainly don't feel like they're on the level of HLE or even contending with a team like HLE right now, which was the goal going into this tournament. But for K-Corp, this was the lifeline they needed to stay alive in this tournament. Things are certainly not guaranteed. A lot of luck would still need to happen in order for K-Corp to be the team that ends up not, leaving first, making it out of the group stage, getting that, like, 4th seed or something like that. Like, other things would have to go drastically wrong for CFO and Team Liquid, but theoretically, it is still possible, and so for that, it's definitely going to be interesting to see. All right, but that is going to do it for day number 3 of the 2025 First Stand International Tournament. Up on the screen, the standings over halfway through the group stage. Yes, I'm saying that right, over halfway done with this round-robin group stage, and look who's at the bottom of these standings. Top Esports is currently the team on the outside looking in. Now, that's obviously circumstantial because they have yet to play CFO. That's the only team they have yet to play at that tournament. That should be a victory for them, so they should be sitting at 2-2, but things are still looking concerning for them. They should have never even been this close in the first place. The fact that they just lost to K-Corp today is kind of a disaster in a lot of different ways, and that means K-Corp, at least for now, is in the top 4. Now, that's not necessarily expected to last. They only have one series remaining as well, and that is against Hanwha Life, and so if you're looking at that and you're going, probably walking out of here at 1-3. Team Liquid probably walking out of here at 2-2 would be the expectation with their win over K-Corp. They probably pick up the win over CFO, and they probably drop the series to HLE, and so you're kind of expecting them to sit at 2-2 and be able to make it out pretty easily. I guess anything can happen with CFO, but if CFO end up losing their 2 remaining series, which again is expected, losing to Team Liquid, losing to Top Esports, they would have the head-to-head advantage over K-Corp. Therefore, they would be the team that ends up moving on. So K-Corp is certainly not saved or anything like that. They would need some sort of miracle to end up happening here. I would imagine that game score is a tiebreaker. Like, as far as I'm aware, game score is a tiebreaker. Like, if K-Corp has a better record at the end of this, I would think that they would qualify over. I would assume head-to-head is only below that, but let me know what the actual intricacies of that are down in the comment section below. That being said, another way that obviously K-Corp can survive is for CFO to pull off the upset against Top Esports. If Top Esports lose against CFO, they're eliminated. Like, it's done, dusted. They do not get out of the group stage, and so that is a must-win series now for Top Esports. HLE, of course, sitting comfortably undefeated at the top of the standings. They're the only team already with 2 wins, and that guarantees you out of this group stage. So they're definitely feeling good about that, but let me know what you guys think down in the comments section below. Are you excited for the rest of this tournament, or has, HLE's dominance kind of put a little bit of a damper on maybe the high-end expectation of this? I'm curious to hear your thoughts and opinions. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help this video out a ton, so please leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We'll be posting about every day of the First Stand tournament, the rest of this tournament, both the final 2 days of the group stage and then the semifinals and finals this upcoming weekend. We'll be getting back into some domestic coverage as well for the LTA, the LEC, the LCK, and the LPL, as we normally do when things start to return to normal domestic play, obviously for the spring split. So if you're interested in any of that stuff, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all